Hello and welcome to my easy to understand guide to Tide, which is a print advert set text at A-level for the Media Studies Eduqas exam. Tide could appear in a question in component 1 for one of two sections, and that is either representation or audiences. I'm going to do this video, which is going to be focused on audiences for Tide, but there is a separate video about representations, so if you're interested in the representation questions using Tide, then please check that video out as well. And if it does come up within the audience questions, they will be stepped questions, some that require shorter one word or one sentence answers, and some that require a more in-depth answer as well. And it is going to require some factual knowledge about the product, its target audience, and some understanding of how that product, the advert, targets those particular people. So you're going to need to be able to identify the target audience for Tide. This is reasonably simple. You can probably tell from the advert and the choices of people within the advert that the target audience is female, predominantly probably 18 to 40. It's hard to tell the age of the women in the advert because they're illustrated, they're almost timeless. It's very difficult to tell their age, and I guess that helps the advert appeal to a wider age range of people. But in the 1950s, the kind of people who would be on their own shopping for laundry products and doing the laundry for themselves and their families would have been those women who were housewives and who had their own families, and they would have been around 18 to 40 years of age. The product is likely to be targeted mostly at white women. Don't forget, in the 1950s, immigration and diversity was only really just starting to happen within Britain, and predominantly the audiences that were targeted by products on television and in the print media were white women. And so perhaps that is why there's a lack of other ethnicities within the advert. And because it does mention America within the advert, we can assume that the target audience is predominantly Americans, although it would also have appealed to any woman within post-war allied countries, so Britain, etc. as well. What you need to be able to do is have a think about how it appeals to that particular target audience. So the fact that the choice of characters in the advert are women aged 18 to 40 are very beautiful. That is a way of targeting women who had aspirations to be perfect housewives, perfect mothers. So the representations are a good way of targeting that audience. The use of language, they use the word woman or women so many times in this advert that it is clear that that is who they're targeting. So it's important to be able to see how they've used language to target that audience as well. They use a lot of direct address, so the use of the word you appears several times within the advert. So that direct mode of address is a good way of drawing in your target audience too. The images they used would have appealed to the target audience. The image of the lady appears to be a kind of subtle intertextual reference to perhaps a wartime propaganda poster featuring a character called Rosie the Riveter. This advert might have reminded many audiences in the 50s of that advert, which was quite famous within the 1940s. And so that's a good way of targeting those audiences in the 50s who may have remembered the Rosie the Riveter poster from the previous decade. The woman's dress codes, so her outfit, her hairstyle, and the curls with the headscarf actually reflects what was fashionable in the 1950s. There were many famous film stars like Betty Grable and Veronica Lake who had hairstyles like this. And so the representations would have reflected what was popular at the time. The clothes hanging on the washing line in the cartoon strip at the bottom of the advert help us to identify the marital status and family situation of the target audience. There are men's shirts and there are children's clothes on the washing line, which suggests that the target audience are going to be women who are married in heterosexual relationships with children, as was quite common for that age group in the 1950s. There is an image of the washing machine in the top right-hand part of the advert, and this is also a really good way of targeting that post-war 1950s audience, because in the 1950s we had this sudden boom of consumerism. Rationing had ended, people started to get more disposable income, consumerism went through the roof, and people started to be able to buy new technologies like washing machines that they'd never had before. And so the use of what would have been a very new and very fashionable item like a washing machine machine on the advert is a really good way of drawing in those audiences in the 1950s, and in particular those audiences that aspired to be fashionable or have the latest technologies, and in order to impress all their friends. There is a small stamp on the advert which says guaranteed by Good Housekeeping. Now, Good Housekeeping is and was a magazine, still exists today, aimed obviously at women who are primarily based in the home. And Good Housekeeping was seen as quite an aspirational opinion leader for audiences. It was a magazine that was very well respected by women of this particular demographic. And so featuring its kind of seal of approval or endorsement on the advert would help to attract women, because they would think, well, if Good Housekeeping thinks this product is good quality, then it must be. The advert uses a variety of written language in order to try and encourage the audience to take that preferred reading. They use words like miracle, trust, like no other, and they're constantly using those words to build up this idea that Tide is brilliant and that it is very different to all other wash products on the market at the time. So the use of the words is there to try and encourage the audiences to take that preferred reading that Tide is a great product. Some audiences in the 1950s and some audiences in modern day periods may have reacted in more of a negotiated or oppositional way to this advert. For example, those women who were starting to develop more feminist ideas, as was happening in the 1950s and going into the 60s, may well have seen this advert and felt that perhaps it was a little sexist, old-fashioned, and they didn't want to be seen as housewives loving their domestic chores. Some women may have felt it oversimplified their lives. Certainly modern audiences often look at adverts like this and respond in quite an oppositional way, feeling as though it is an incredibly sexist, old-fashioned advert. But the way audiences respond will entirely depend on their gender, for example, whether they're male or female. Men might respond very differently to this advert, and the cultural context they come from, whether they do a lot of housework, and the historical time period which the audience originates from as well. If you're looking for audience theory, Gerbner and his cultivation theory could be applied to this advert, with the idea being that many women would have been exposed to a lot of adverts like this in the 1950s. And so the effects of this advert and the effects of the media language and the representations might have built up and up and up over time as they'd seen more and more adverts of women enjoying housework, of perfect lifestyles, of Tide. And so perhaps the effects on an audience could be seen to cultivate or develop over time, depending on if they've seen a lot of other adverts that are similar. Gerbner might also believe that this advert is trying to cultivate or develop particular ideas and viewpoints. So if you have a look at the advert, there are lots of messages that are repeated several times. There's 3 separate bullet points where they reiterate over and over again that this is going to be the cleanest wash, the whitest wash. There's lots of repetition within the advert about how this is exactly what women want. This is giving the audience, giving women what they desire. And so repeated messages throughout the advert, hopefully from Procter & Gamble's point of view, are going to cultivate the idea in the audience's mind that Tide is the best product on the market. You can see that these messages might have cultivated over time as well if you look at some of Tide's other adverts from the same decade. The styles, the messages, the images are all very similar, and so perhaps the effects and the meanings from these adverts might have cultivated over time to really enforce the idea with the audience that Tide was the greatest product on the market for laundry. Another thing that you might want to know for this audiences section is how audiences might use media products differently. You might want to look at the uses and gratifications theory for this. It's not a set theory, but it does come in useful for working out how audiences use products differently. Many audiences would still have looked at adverts for entertainment value. It still would have seemed quite quirky. They hadn't really got to the stage in the 1950s of being really bored by advertising, as we often are now. And so many audiences would have quite liked to look at these adverts and been quite entertained, particularly in this advert, by the kind of nice brightly coloured images, the cartoon strip, lots of writing, and it would have seemed perhaps quite exciting to some audiences. Other audiences might have used adverts like this for information about products. There were very few places where women could get information about products to buy. A lot of people didn't have televisions yet. It wasn't very commonplace in the 1950s. It was still quite a new technology. And there was no internet, obviously. So if you wanted to get information about new products that were out on the market or what different products might do for you, then looking at the adverts and reading all this information and the small print would have been a good way to get information for an audience in the 1950s. Many audiences might also have looked at this product and been able to identify with the people in it. So being able to identify maybe with their lifestyles or with what they wanted to achieve. And they may have seen it as escapist and aspirational, something that, perhaps audiences at the time would have looked at adverts and used it to dream about having a better life. Some people may not have had a lot of money after the war and may have seen adverts like this and really enjoyed looking at them to dream of what they could buy when they had more money in the future.